So again, welcome to the April 2023 Dr. NAACLS. We'll be talking about Standard 2 today, specifically documentation. But before we do that, happy Medical Laboratory Professionals Week. I know it's probably a big week for everybody, whether you are at a university or hospital base. So yeah, NAACLS just wanted to officially wish everybody a happy Medical Laboratory Professionals Week. We like to date stamp these, as many of you are probably aware who've seen these videos. We are recording this on April 26th to 2023. The reason we date stamp these is because NAACLS core documents may be updated twice a year. For example, we just had our board meeting in last week, 2 weeks ago. Time is starting to blend. So it's very likely that items in the standard compliance guidance, even some standards that went out to public comment in September, will be changing. So since we talk about a lot of compliance issues on these Dr. NAACLS, please double check the website for the standards compliance guide or contact staff if you have any questions to see if some compliances have changed. Today's team, I am joined by our volunteer content expert, Ramona Fox, who is a NAACLS Review Committee member, and I, of course, am Mark Spence, Director of Strategic Initiatives here at NAACLS. So let's talk about Standard 2. Standard 2, NAACLS tracks our most cited standards, and Standard 2 is often the most cited standard, and the documentation required and submitted for the standard is very likely the issue behind those citations. So today we're going to go through each substandard for Standard 2 and discuss kind of where we see bumps in the road for what items are supplied on documentation and maybe some tips about how to avoid those mistakes. One recurring theme you'll see, and we'll get into this in detail later, is that a lot of these issues come from when these things are being discussed, it's not appropriately or clearly identified within meeting minutes or things of that nature. So let's start with Standard 2A. So Standard 2A requires that there must be a documented assessment plan, and specifically the documentation is looking for that the assessment plan documentation identifies the following items: the responsible individuals, processes, and a schedule of timeline for identified and assessment methods. So Ramona, can you kind of go into some detail about what you've seen that's been really successful for Standard 2A, and maybe some items that are reoccurring, some things that you've seen reoccurring that may consistently cause programs problems?
Okay. First, I think for Standard 2A, one of the best and most helpful things I've seen is if the program director has some sort of document. I like spreadsheets that include all of the assessments that your program is completing, especially the required ones and also others, because I think everybody is continuously assessing their program and making changes to improve it, and those should be followed and documented. So if you have a spreadsheet that includes what the item is you're assessing, who's responsible for collecting the data, and how you're measuring that particular item is important. And also, for me, I also have a column in my spreadsheet that shows or identifies when that particular item has been completed. For ongoing assessments that are required, it won't have an end date, but other things that you're doing, maybe revising curriculum or changing the order of courses or things like that, you can identify when those particular items are done, and that can also help you determine when you need to go back and assess, evaluate, and determine if your changes were successful. So something else that people have done, I've seen, is when these assessments should be reviewed, people can give themselves reminders in their calendars or something like that so that you don't fall behind and all of a sudden the report's due to NAACLS or for accreditation, and you say, oh, well, I haven't really looked at that for 2 years. So I think creating some sort of document, some sort of timeline, and some sort of cue to yourself on when these things need to be addressed is very helpful.
So moving on to standard 2B. Some items that we're looking for standard 2B are examples of tools used to gather outcome measures. So each substandard under 2B, 2B1, 2B2, etc. requires that these examples be tools that have been already used with the names redacted. I think it's a good point to make because I know I have heard from review committee members that often they will see templates or plans of what they will be doing moving forward, but generally, and Ramona can speak to more of this, review committee members or reviewers, while they appreciate programs seeing what will happen, it's not marked compliant unless they can confirm it's actually done.
Yes. So tips for 2B is make sure that you document everything. So if it's not in writing somewhere, it didn't happen. Analysis of your information. So some charts and graphs are nice. Or even depending on what the particular thing is that you're assessing, sometimes it doesn't lend itself to a chart or a graph. Maybe you're just changing the length of a rotation and you're based on student feedback, and your assessment is going to be talking to the students about did it work or not. And so if you're doing that where it's kind of an anecdotal record, you still need to document that I talked to, you know, all 10 of my students, and this was the feedback from them. And then you have to look at the effectiveness of the changes made. And so just making a statement that it worked is probably not complete enough. So you would want to have that information documented somewhere, whether it's in a faculty meeting or your committee meeting, that, you know, we looked at these things, we polled our students, and the students felt that this change was successful or, you know, worked. You can also follow up if you're making changes in a particular course. You can follow board scores to make sure that, you know, your scores don't drop, and maybe they'll go up, but at least you know that the change didn't have a negative effect. So again, but you need to document these changes and the effectiveness. So where we see a lot of issues with standard 2B is that we make plans and make changes, but then we oftentimes don't go back as program directors and analyze the effect of those changes and then document that, the effectiveness of the change. So you have to kind of determine for your program where that documentation is going to take place. If it's going to take place in a faculty meeting or an advisory committee meeting, you can document it anywhere as long as it is documented. Another thing that happens a lot is some programs are doing quite well, and on their outcomes measures, they're meeting all of their benchmarks and or NAACLS benchmarks. So we will see data presented in advisory committee meetings showing that, you know, our program's doing really well, but you need to be careful that you just don't submit a PowerPoint as proof that everything was discussed. So you need some kind of notes either added to the PowerPoint or with the PowerPoint to show that discussion happened and it wasn't just strictly a program director showing results without any discussion or evaluation of them. So those are things that we look for as a review committee to see that a discussion was had, that if you decided that no changes need to be made at this time, you can state that, but we're looking for evidence that evaluation occurred, and that if no evaluation needs to take place, then state that. A lot of times, you know, we look at graduation and attrition rates. Sometimes those aren't they're tracked, and sometimes they aren't presented in committee meeting minutes. So those are some of the things that we look for, just to make sure that all of the data that you are collecting and analyzing is documented somewhere and up for discussion and analysis.
Okay, let's move on to standard 2C. So 2C, we're broken into two sections because standard 2C is our most cited standard. So we wanted to make sure we really dug into both components of this. So standard 2C1, graduates' employees' feedback must be used when program reviews and evaluates its outcomes. If, for example, if a program utilizes surveys to gather this feedback, completed surveys with names redacted should be provided as documentation. If you're using meeting minutes, make sure those minutes clearly show what is being discussed. This is something that Ramona referred to a little bit before. Avoid generic terms such as outcomes discussion. Reviewers, outside parties such as reviewers and review committee members have a hard time knowing what was specifically discussed with the outcomes. Phrases like that don't tell the reviewers if the discussion is about a review of those outcomes and evaluation of the outcomes or something else. So Ramona, did you have anything to add on 2C1?
With graduate and employer feedback, I know a lot of times we have lots of statements that it's difficult to get these feedback back from your graduates and the employers of those graduates. But you have to do the best you can, and you have to evaluate what you get back. I mean, some programs are more effective at getting it back than others, but even if you only get a couple of them back, it doesn't mean you shouldn't evaluate what you did receive and show that you're at least attempting to get this type of feedback, and you're attempting to use it in your program review, assessment, and evaluation. I know sometimes it's difficult with small numbers, but maybe you can track it over time to see if there are any things from the feedback you do get that shows up more than once that might need to be addressed. But even if you only get a couple back, you still need to include what you get in your outcomes assessment. And if there is any usable information, you should try to utilize it. And I know sometimes you can use appropriate questions on your surveys that may help you evaluate some changes you've made in your program. So again, if you're making changes related to course content, or when those courses are offered, if you're changing, the delivery, you might want to have questions that address this on your graduate surveys. Employer surveys should provide you feedback that is relevant to your program. I have seen a few programs that collected information that was mostly dealt with what schedules and what shifts and pay ranges, which I think really isn't relevant to the effectiveness of the program. So again, you need to make sure that the questions on your surveys are going to be helpful to you in evaluating your program's effectiveness.
Great. Moving on to 2C2. Programs must create a process of documenting changes made and how effectiveness is evaluated. The programs must ensure that the process is clear to reviewers, again, recurring theme, as well as when the documentation provided is for changes made to the program, and when the documentation applies to how the program evaluates its effectiveness. So I think it's really important that we remember that standard 2 is not only assessment, but also quality improvement, and that continual quality improvement is always required. Ramona, did you have anything specifically about 2C2?
Not specifically, but I just can't stress enough that it's not, an action plan is great, and lots of programs have them, or sometimes it's required based on your benchmarks, but you also have to follow up and document the effectiveness of that action plan. And that's something that a lot of times seems to be missing. or at least the documentation of that follow-up is missing. So again, it's not enough to just have an action plan and put it into place at some defined point. You need to go back and say, well, did it work? And if it worked, that's great. Then you can say, okay, well, we've made the changes and they worked. If it didn't work or didn't work enough, then you may want to make some additional changes that then basically becomes a new project to try to get at the outcome that you're looking for. So again, documentation is really important. Doing everything you can to help your reviewers find and see the information that you want them to see is important. So if you can highlight things or refer to specific pages in a document, that's really helpful to reviewers, because sometimes we get, 50 pages of material to review, and we're trying to comb through that and find exactly what it is you want us to see. So it's always helpful if you can highlight the areas that specifically address the question or the standard.
Yeah, one recommendation we often make is that not just for standard 2, but other aspects, whether it's a self-study or site visit, NAACLS makes our review forms readily available on the website. So if you have somebody, maybe not in your department, somebody not used to NAACLS language, but somebody from outside that can kind of see our review form and maybe look at this documentation, and if an outside party can track some of these items, or if they don't really understand when certain items are being discussed in minutes or those documents, it may provide you a little bit of heads up time, because if those outside parties don't quite know when these things are being discussed, it's very likely that our reviewers will not as well. So that's kind of all we have for standard 2 right now. We're going to open up to Q&A. Before we get to Q&A, we're going to do our plug for our DLPs. The DLPs are discipline lead persons. These are review committee members that emails are readily available on our website, and they are available to talk about standard interpretation. They're not necessarily there to, give a once over to an application packet or review a whole progress report before it goes in. That kind of crosses the line to consultation. It also kind of is a little burdensome to our very generous volunteers. But if you have a question specifically about 2C2 documentation or 2B documentation, or maybe items in standard 4 when it comes to publishing the required published documents you need on the website, they can definitely help with those very specific compliance questions. Also, I see many volunteers on our call right now, so thank you to all our NAACLS volunteers, including Ramona, who do generously devote their time and their expertise to NAACLS. So we will open up to questions right now. Go ahead and drop those in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can do it over Zoom if anybody has questions. Oh, we have somebody raise your hand. So Lori, I have just allowed you to talk, but you'll still have to unmute on your end.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're pretty faint, but go ahead.
Okay, so just a general question. For example, if you're making, your program is exceeding and, the outcomes and, as far as like, graduation rates and stuff like that, how do you monitor, like she was saying, document for continuous improvement and quality assessment? Is there any way we could get an example with like the information didactic or something of examples of how, you meet this standard?
Do you mean examples in the actual NAACLS documentation, like standard compliance guide, or do you mean just
like just a,
right
like someone who met, one of your people that, they just got evaluated and, How did they meet, could get an example, or, you know what I mean? Without, like, they met this standard by doing this. I know you talked about assessment and, make sure you document the outcomes, and once you, document it, evaluate it. But, is there can you give me an example of like how it's meant to be?
I don't know, Ramona, if you have an example off the top of your head about documenting that stuff in addition, I mean, other than what you've already provided.
So are you talking about so all your outcomes are good? Is that what you're, how do you I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
Yeah. Yeah,
rates are good, but how do you then, if that's good, how do you assess things for quality improvement then? And document that. That's what we're having a hard time with.
Yeah, I think from what I heard, because Lori, you're going in and out, from what I heard, Ramona, is that her outcomes are great. So we can even use this as more of a broad example. If your outcomes are 100 across the board, but you're still required to show these changes and continual quality, you're still required to do changes, assessment, and improvement. Do you have any strategies or examples how you would do that for a program that's already high achieving when it comes to the benchmarks?
So I think I have seen programs that have, really great benchmarks outcomes. And what they do is, of course, you track and you evaluate, because your evaluation is showing that you're exceeding your benchmarks. And then at that point, you can have that up for discussion, and let's say, okay, so you can just have a discussion point that for, I don't know, the 5th year in a row, we've exceeded the benchmark by X%, or something that shows that you're tracking it. And then you can say, no changes required at this time, because you are doing well, but it shows that you're monitoring and that, your program is doing well. Or you may find something else that, like, for instance, maybe you review your courses on every few years or so. That could be another thing that you just say, okay, well, we went over the course and we updated the course, and then we look at board scores for the next year to make sure that they didn't drop. So I find it hard to believe that nobody does anything to improve their program, other than just look at the benchmarks. But you can document good benchmarks. You don't have to make changes every single time, but you need to document that you looked at it and that you made a decision we're meeting them, so we don't need to make any changes. Does that help?
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
1 second. So a few more questions right now. This one I can answer. How often do DLPs change? Our discipline lead persons are appointments by our review committee chairs. So those generally change maybe once a year. There's a lot of variables with that. They are volunteers. So, I mean, it's depending about how much time they can take on, depending on their class load, depends on other things they have going on. So some people may do 6 months, some people may only choose to do 3 months. For our smaller disciplines, when there's fewer people available, DMS stands out right now with Eric. There's a smaller volunteer pool, there's fewer people on the committee, so those may not change as often. So yeah, I don't have there's not a great formulaic, everybody changes on this date kind of time for that. Is there an automated program system some programs are using to collect the monitor and continuous improvement? I think this question kind of goes in with the second one, so I'll kind of lump these. Oh, it's the same person, Diane, I'm sorry. I guess I should read your name first. Could NAACLS post examples or documents of databases used by programs doing well on this assessment? We can certainly discuss that, and I do take these ideas back, and we can discuss that on the review committee level. I can tell you that the board generally is very hesitant to put examples in the standard compliance guide, because it is not inconceivable that somebody would see a quote unquote example by an accreditor and think that that is a requirement. because any word, even if it's a recommendation from an accreditor, not even a recommendation, if it is a example by an accreditor, either a program can think it would be a requirement, or or maybe even a more experienced reviewer may see that in the standard compliance guide and may make an assumption that that's what the accreditor really wanted. So we certainly look at ways to make things easier and more transparent for our program directors, but we also want to make sure that we give our program directors a lot of area and flexibility and different pathways to achieve this compliance. Any other questions? Lori, did you still have a question, or was your hand just still raised? I'll wait a little bit.
Mark, I know on the first question.
Yeah.
If the discipline lead person is not the person that's on the website, if it's changed, you can always contact NAACLS staff, and they have the current person and can give you their contact information if the website hasn't caught up with the changes.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Ramona. Angela Lester says, would anyone be willing to share their spreadsheet for tracking changes? I can put in a quick plug for the ASCLS Educators Listserv. There's always things like that going around. It's a very, I found the educators community to be incredibly generous when it comes to those kind of tools and things of that. So Angela, if you have not joined the ASCLS Educators Listserv or Clinical Laboratory Educators Listserv, I would recommend doing that. I think the instructions to do that are on the NAACLS Program Directors page, pretty much all the way at the bottom. So if you go to NAACLS.org, the Program Directors section, just scroll all the way to helpful links, and I believe sign up is there for you or anybody else that may not be aware of that listserv. It's incredibly active. Any more questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, everybody. Oh, wait a minute. Jennifer Knight just chimed in. She's still the MLS DLP and she can help. Her email is on the website. Nancy, there is no script for the webinar, but these do get posted on YouTube, so they're available to listen to. I go completely off the cuff, which you may have noticed as I was kind of stumbling for words earlier today. So it kind of took me a while to warm up.
And if you have another question or other questions, I'd be happy to talk with you offline.
Okay, it looks like we've resolved the questions. If something does occur to you later, feel free to reach out to DLP or Ramona. If not, you will get a notification through the NAACLS news about the next session very, very soon from May. Thank you, Ramona, for your time.
No problem.
Diana, do you see that question? We are discussing workshops, so I will bring that to the table when we discuss workshops within staff. So everybody else, have a great day.